So I thought today I'd talk a little bit about some of the work that I started with my PhD that Dr. Abhiyan had mentioned. I'll just talk about the survey and very little about the excavation, and then continue to talk about the more recent survey that we have been doing. I hope you can see the slide moving because sometimes you can't. Okay, I'll assume you can see the next slide. So I've divided the talk into talking a little bit about what I did at Siruthavoor in terms of mapping the burials there. This was something that I did from 2006 to 10, but really the fieldwork was more between 2008 and 10. 2008 was when we did the excavation, and then I continued doing the survey before and after that. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the similarities that I noticed between the discrete locations, both at Siruthavoor, but also comparing it to Armor, which is where I'm doing the current fieldwork. And then thinking a little bit about like how we can kind of like think a little more about the broader ideas of Iron Age early historic through this case study. This is most of the information on this map I had created using Dr. Rajan's book on Tamilnadu and excavated sites. And I just basically I used the sites that they had reported in that book to map it in this study area. I should also say that there has been, both yesterday and today, there's been some conversation on regional variations, and I think therefore I wanted to qualify the study area that I had chosen. To a large extent, I've been working in North Tamil Nadu, but really the study area is much smaller. If you can see like this small inset here, and the surveyed area is this shape here. But I also wanted to locate it within the larger context, but also I'm aware that a lot of how we direct fieldwork is unfortunately influenced by contemporary political administrative boundaries for various logistic and other regions. But I think it's useful to think that I do think it would potentially be much more useful thinking of some districts in southern Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka when thinking of this region as well. But anyway, my study area is much smaller, so it doesn't matter for this paper. So I'm just talking about this area here. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of like the classifications that have been done. I think there've been a couple of speakers who've spoken about the the vast amount of research that's been done on typology, the different classifications that's been done. This was a paper that I had presented at a different conference where we had looked at the historiography of typology and like tried to understand where like some of this nomenclature is coming from and how we're using it. But here I'd just like to point out like, what a huge variation there is between the different scholars. Like this is Swami, and I think the other names you'll all be very familiar with. But also, I mean, this particular paper that I had worked on, I'd also tried to see how much where they were working had influenced the way they were thinking about terminology and typology. But nonetheless, here I've stuck with the names of the scholars who worked on it. But given like the huge number of ways in which we refer to similar burials and like in different regions, but different scholars, different time periods as well, I think it's worth kind of thinking of how we're using this terminology and what we're referring to as we're doing it. I'll come back to this towards the end of my paper. So, I mean, I'd start by referring a little more to Dr. U.S. Murthy's work, where he's dividing it into sepulchral, non-sepulchral. But I thought I'd use this example a little bit first of the fixed burials to talk a little bit more about what we've seen. And I think it kind of flows quite well from the previous paper, because he'd also spoken about, Dr. Shantam had also spoken about the cane circles and the different ones. So the specific area that I'm talking about is this, which, if you remember from the first map, this was the shape that I had incorporated in that map. And the first part of my talk, I'll talk about this particular sub-area within the yellow circle, which is what I did in 2008 and 10. And the excavation was in this area, which is where the burials are located at Siruthavoor. This is the current kind of like settlement there. And this is a Shiva temple, which is an absolute temple where there is epigraphic evidence from 10th century onwards. So we were also kind of like looking in terms of habitation settlement in that area, but mostly what we found was medieval, both in terms of what's there in the surface remains, but that's something we're also looking into in the last few years. So going back to Professor U.S. Murthy's classification of like the different pit burials, I just wanted to use that actually as a reference to the different kinds that he has mentioned, and also talk about like the differences we saw at Siruthavoor as well. So some of the things I had tried to think about during the PhD was whether the location of the burial. So for example, this one, the image below, is closer to a water body, whereas the image above is closer to a hillock of sorts. And one of the things I looked at is post-depositional kind of variation. So we did some geochemistry and texture analysis to understand erosion and deposition. And obviously during monsoon and rainfall, there is erosion that's happening and deposition as well. So one of the things I thought about was how that was affecting the surface appearance today of these burials. However, you can clearly see that they are quite different as well. There's a lot of like chain packing here, whereas this is much flatter without too many like smaller stones on top of it. So thinking about these different variations, one of the things I conducted was like a mapping of these burial sites. I have to say that the classification system I used at that time in 2008 was based on Dr. Rajan's work, which he's published, as well as a little bit from V.D. Krishnaswamy's work from 1950. So I used basically those nomenclatures when I was thinking about this particular site. And so we mapped over 500 burials in this site, and there were a couple of interesting things which I wanted to highlight here for this talk. One of the things that I noticed was that, as you can see here, the red ones are all the circle burials, and they're all definitely spatially segregated, where you don't find any of the other burial types in this place, the cyst, the dolmen, or any of the others. Whereas you do find circles, I don't know if you can see this, I know the dots are really small, but you can see some red dots, especially around this area, which I'll come back to. You can see some circles in other places as well. But the rest of the site, so this area here, which is doesn't have any dots, is basically because sand quarrying had destroyed all the burials in this area, and all of the area around it, there were a lot of exposed sections, which I tried to document the disturbed burials along these sections. But the rest of it, as you can see here, have a different spatial patterning in terms of the burial types through this site. So one of the things that I did more recently was run a cluster analysis using GIS software to try and understand the significance of the clustering of the burials here. And as you can see, that there is a significance in terms of the clustering of the burials at this site, which I think is, if you look at it more closely, is also kind of visually evident. So you can see here, I've tried to differentiate the different burial types. So you can see the cyst. Again, here it's kind of like clustered or group pattern. Here you can see more of the cyst, whereas you can see the dolmen with the circle. So this is both with the circle. You can see them more in this area. And similarly, I tried to look at just the cyst, the dolmen, and the dolmenoid cyst. I'm not sure. I'm as over the survey and the current work I'm doing, I'm not exactly sure how to kind of categorize the dolmenoid cyst, because while it does seem kind of different, I'm not quite sure I understand how we can actually think about the dolmenoid cyst, but that's not part of this talk, so I won't go into it. But again, you can see the cyst and the dolmen, which is the orange dots. You can see that they are kind of spatially segregated to a large extent as well. I'll come back to the clusters in these two in a minute. But one of the things that came out of the survey was that while we have these broad kind of classifications, and I think Dr. Shantanu in the previous talk had also referred to this, there's a lot of variations within these broad classifications. So for example, when we think of the dolmen, one of the things I noticed in Siruthavoor is these are 4 different burials, but you can see there's a lot of similarity in appearance. So there's a lot of like similar burial types within the dolmen, but they are distinct in some way. So for example, these were some of the differences that I had documented in my PhD. So you can see that, and there is a reoccurrence of these. So this is the one that I've sketched for this particular type. And you can see that there are these long slabs that have been used in this. And it isn't that they are unique or they're one, but they occur repeatedly at the site. But for this study, I classified them only as dolmen. But I noticed that these were the differences that happened. So kind of to break down the spatial pattern a little bit, I thought it'd be useful to think about it with 4 different like locations at the site from the documentation that I did. And this particular first one, the A that I'm talking about now, is basically around a hillock. So this is the hillock, and this is a circle that is on top of the hillock. And you can see that there's a lot of different kinds of the burial types, especially around the hillock, as opposed to like some of the other locations which I'll come back to. And the other thing that I noticed also is that there were specific significant kinds of burial. So this is the other hillock, which is the D. So there are 2 very small, I'd say like they're more like boulder formation outcrops. They're really small in terms of elevation. It's not very high, but it's more like a natural kind of formation, which I guess we could call a hillock. And the D is the smaller one of the 2 between the A and the B. But again, here you can notice that there is clustering of the different types in this specific location. So at A, one of the things I had like documented was that these were 2 different burial types that were at 2 ends of the hillock, really. So you can see this circle with the dolmen inside actually uses the natural boulders of the hillock as part of the circle. And there were these 2 stones here that you can see, which look kind of like different from the rest of them. And I haven't seen any of the other cane circles, at least here, which look so distinct. And then the other, so this would be at this end of the hillock, whereas at this end, there was this one particular dolmen, which was similar to actually one of the images from the Dr. Shantanu's talk, where it is much higher in terms of like the boulders are much larger. And again, it uses the outcrop here as part of the cane circle, which is the other end of the hillock. And then one of the other different kinds of burial patterns which I noticed again around the hillock were these overlaid cane circles with a feature that was in between, in the middle of the circle. I don't know if you can see it clearly, but you can see here that there are 2 overlapping. So this photograph is probably looking at it from this direction. So you can see these 2 circles and this one here. And then the other thing I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about was this area. And I don't know if you could recall the previous one around the hillock that I spoke about. You can see that there's a much more clustering of different spatial patterns, different burial types here. So you can see that the cyst, while there are exceptions of 1 or 2 circles, you can see that there are more cysts here, as opposed to the dolmen and the dolmen with circle, which you can see more around here. And while there is overlap of the 2 different burial types, there does seem to be some segregation in terms of spatial types at this location. And then this is the other kind of region. So I've basically divided it so that it's clearer into different locations. And this is the other one where you can see more of the dolmen with circle and the dolmenoid cysts, which is the green ones. But one of the other things I noticed is that the dolmenoid cysts definitely were spatially located between the dolmen and the dolmen with circle, as opposed to finding them amongst the cysts, which is the other reason I kind of like thought that this requires us to think a little more about this particular category that we use. And then we also excavated 8 different burials, but as I was saying, so I did some geochemistry, so I had some little sections amongst the burials to kind of see what could be the post-depositional kind of changes that could have happened. But I won't go into that. All of this is published, and you can actually find both in my PhD thesis, but also different publications. But just to give you an idea, this was some of the excavation, some of the burials we excavated. So this is from a dolmen with a circle, which we excavated and also dated, which is the burial 5 here. And one of the things we found from dating this particular burial is that there were 2 different dates that we got. We did OSL dating for the sarcophagus because I thought that was the most permanent in this context, permanent kind of pottery or artifact that you could find within it because it was the sarcophagus. So we dated 2 of them, and we found that they were 2 different dates. They were separated. And I think there has definitely been some work that has mentioned the reuse of burials. And so this was another thing we were thinking of within that. This is a cyst with a circle. This was actually partially destroyed from the sand quarrying, disturbed maybe more than destroyed from the sand quarrying. And we were more interested in kind of seeing what information we could get from it. So we excavated that, and this was, I think it was also connected to some of the papers that spoke yesterday about, I think, Dr. Jenny Peters, that spoke about carnelian beads with cysts. And that was another thing we found here as well, is that the carnelian beads that we found were with the cysts, and the number of pottery and iron artifacts were much more numerous with the cysts. The cyst was also more recent in date. It was more around 500 AD CE, while the dolmen was 300 BCE. So this is from some of the sections that were disturbed from sand quarrying that I tried to document some of them since they were already being destroyed as well. But the good thing was it gives you a snapshot into what is inside the burial and not just of what's on the surface. And here you can see that this is part of the king circle, and then there is a slab here. There isn't much of, like, in terms of a monument besides the slab. So when we look on the surface, we're only seeing this one slab. But within the circle, you can see there's an urn here, and there's a sarcophagus. You can see the legs here. So it's also interesting. One of the things that I thought about during this survey was how we're trying to understand these burials from the surface, while it's really interesting in terms of what's happening below the surface as well. And so this was a circle that was excavated. This is a circle that's close to the water body, which I don't think was very clear on my map, but maybe in the first Google Earth image it was clearer. So you can see there's a circle here, and this was a pit that we excavated, which is here, and there was a slab here, which is kind of what I want to talk about in this particular slide. So on the surface, before we started the excavation, all we could see was the slab. Whereas when you look within, it seems much more complex, even though we didn't find any pottery actually within these pits, but we did find very fragmentary and small amounts of pottery outside the circle. And then there was a sarcophagus on the western half of the circle, but not within the pit. There was no pottery here. And there was one or two iron artifacts around the sarcophagus. So I just want to draw attention to, this is a circle that I documented during the survey. And as you can see that there is some kind of slab-like feature here, which I think in a sense, I think the tendency is to only think of this as a circle, whereas we now, I think, and I think that's another thing that Dr. Shankar also spoke about. Now, I think with increasing kind of information we're getting, it's clear that the different burial types and the different features within or around these burials are also important in terms of how we document it and think about these different burials. And then I think this is also something that came out, is the fact that some of the urns, this was an accidental kind of like discovery, because the community around the site was digging a ditch, and we came across a huge number of urns in the sections of the ditch. And again, we did like a clearing and tried to understand it. And you can see that this one didn't have any kind of feature or like appendage to it, whereas this had a stone slab on top. However, it was buried under the surface, so from the surface we couldn't see the stone slab either on top of it. And actually, I should probably also mention that this is the only burial where we found any kind of organic matter or skeletal remains, because most of the others there was no skeletal remains. I also actually did some analysis for phosphate to see if we could kind of think in terms of preservation, because some of the burials of preservation was really bad, even for the pottery. But there weren't any increased levels of phosphate in any of the others, so it's really hard to kind of understand them as anything other than not having them. Again, here, this was a dolmen which we had excavated, but this was one of the reasons for excavating this was to understand its relationship to the outcrop which I had spoken about, which is the smaller one in the D panel that I had spoken about previously. And you can see that these are part of the natural features of that hillock or outcrop or whatever. And during the excavation, we noticed that the artifacts like the pottery and the iron artifacts were all within the natural outcrops rather than within the dolmen that was here. So clearly it was like the natural features, form a part of the cultural artifacts, and that's something we need to think about as well. So in a sense, that's kind of a really small, quick snapshot of what we understood from Siruthavoor. But one of the other things that got me thinking about this was the kind of like spatial segregation that happens at the site, because after I started doing the survey at Siruthavoor, I noticed that there were locations where there were burial clusters that were not necessarily in a sense continued from here, but also in close proximity to be thinking of it as one continuation. But so in a sense, to introduce that, I thought I'd talk a little bit about other sites in which we've noticed this, where you see there are discrete locations, and you'd still kind of, I guess, consider them one particular burial site, but yet the space between them, I feel, is something to think about. So it's not continuing from one place onto the other, but rather is separated from each other. So this is from Dr. Darshana's PhD thesis that I had found. Some of the maps that she had done also had similar kind of like spaces between the burials that she had documented. Similarly, here at Kodumanal, you can see the same thing. Again, at Brahmagiri, you can again see that there were like specific locations in which there were clusters or concentration of the burials. And then within the locations as well, you can see that there are spatial segregation of the burial types. So coming back to Siruthavoor, that's one of the things that made me think that this is also a huge burial site. And both of these sites are actually protected by ASI. And then you can't see this much on the map, but again, spatially separated from the burials which stop around here. There's another set of burials within the reserve forest, which I actually originally located from Google Earth, and then I located it on the ground as well. And it's within the reserve forest, and it's actually really hard to locate because there is no visual clarity in terms of seeing those burials. So then this is where I decided to then kind of think about using some of what I had understood from the initial mapping that I did at Siruthavoor and see how I can utilize that here at Amur to try and understand the different burial patterns. But just the initial survey that I had done over the last from 2010 onwards, like I had made multiple visits, and some of what I noticed was a similarity in some of the burial features and yet the differences within the site. And I feel like the only way to understand this would be to map both the sites and then see how we can understand it. And I don't know if it's clear thanks to this watermark, but you can see this these two stones here, and there was similar kind of like placement of stones within this dolmen with circle. And this is the, and I actually feel like this is similar to what Dr. Shantanu had mentioned, where we found here as well that there are just stone slabs, which I guess you could call like a capstone burial with nothing that you can visually see from the surface below that. So for this particular survey, what we did, I mean, these were the students who were part of the survey. But I should also mention that this part of it is where we had done some clearing of what had all, there was a pit that had been dug near the Siruthavoor temple, which I had mentioned. And one of the things that I had previously been told by the community living around the present habitation of Siruthavoor is that they found some, what they described as black pottery. So one of the things I wanted to do was do some kind of trial excavation here to see if we can kind of understand the temporality of the settlement as it stands today. So we did, they had already dug a pit near the temple as a part of the conservation work that they were doing. So we basically cleared the section there and tried to understand what was there. Mostly what we got was redware and later medieval pottery here, and not much in terms of artifacts other than that. But we also at the same time continued to do the survey at Armored, and this time one of the things I had thought of was to try and do a grid survey instead of just surveying the megaliths, as I thought that would give me much more control in terms of documenting the different features on the landscape. So basically this red overlay is the grid, and these two white lines is all that we've finished, so we have a long way to go. But one of the things I noticed is that while it's really time consuming, and we basically spaced ourselves within each grid and walked the whole grid like any other kind of surface survey that you do even for a habitation site, and then documented everything we found within each of these grids. So this is a section that we had documented for the habitation site. So this is kind of how the burials on the surface at Armored looks, and this is part of where we've done the survey, where you can see some of the circles. So this is kind of an example of what we found. So this is one particular grid, and again, I feel like the scale is much more different. Like you can see here, these are just really small cane packings, and you can see the urn here. It so happened that this was an area where I think you can see it on Google Earth as well, but the forest department, so this comes under the reserve forest. And one of the other things we were documenting while surveying was also the different natural and cultural kind of like features that that were there on the surface. So, for example, one of the things we've documented is the walls, the stone walls that the reserve forest officials had built in order to channel the water. And I think you can see the water flows this way. So they were basically directing the rainwater to go in one particular direction. And one of the things it does then is that there's a lot of erosion of the soil that happens obviously here. And I think there's a lot of, it's not like a slow flowing water rivulet here, but more of a fast flowing and only during rainy season. So I think that the movement, the erosion of the soil here is like evident, as you can see here. But what it does is that it also exposes the burials there. So on the surface, what would have seemed like just clusters of small rocks together, because of the exposure, we could also document the fact that there were urns below that, and there were like some artifacts that were coming out of it during thanks to the erosion. So we were able to kind of distinguish therefore in some places the urn as opposed to the sarcophagus thanks to this. Whereas what we would otherwise have seen on the surface would have been just a small cluster of stones. So I have to say, I think I've not taken a very long time, but I'm almost coming to the kind of like conclusive part of my talk, where I want to kind of reflect a little bit on how we're understanding these burials, and the nomenclature that's being used and how that's kind of like helping us interpret the burials. So I just kind of thought about a few of the general kind of like um, impressions that we have when we think of these megalithic burials or the Iron Age early historic burials. And I think partially we need to kind of reflect a little bit on the spatial and temporal patterning, or the information we have on spatiality and temporality for these burials, both I think within sites, but also in terms of the larger picture. So some of the things I think we understood, I understood from both Siruthavoor and from Amur, is that the burial terminology that we're using to differentiate the different burial types is something we need to think about a little more in terms of how we can look at the smaller kind of variations of each of the burials. So in the fieldwork that I did in Amur, one of the things I tried to do consciously was to have both the type, which is the ones that we use for classification, but a subtype where it gives us some kind of space to record these variations and see whether in doing that we see spatial patternings of these more specific features of the burials. And then the second thing we noticed is that thanks to the grid survey, we could see, as well as some of the erosion, we could see that around, for example, the circle, one of the circles with the dolmen inside that we documented, that all around it there were burials with these small clusters of stones around it. And so I think that I think it is important to think not just of the larger features of these monumental kind of like burials, but also the more like smaller features around it. So going back to kind of then thinking of the larger context beyond this one particular site, I think I'm kind of being careful here, because I realize that just two sites and the case study of it wouldn't be possible to project this into the larger kind of landscape as like something that helps us understand the larger landscape. But I think the kind of things I wanted to think about is how we date them and classify them, the paucity of dates for sure, but also given the dates that we do have, how do we kind of understand the idea of Iron Age early historic, and where we position these burials within that context. And I think we're all aware that with whatever we have, there is definitely regional kind of like broader variations. But I think some of the things that seem to unite them, and which is what I think ties us together in terms of the peninsular megaliths, is the monumental features, but also the iron artifacts and the black and red ware and the blackware that you find. And this is from an article which I published in Antiquity, where we had published the dates from Siruthavoor. And I think that one of the things that I think we are all aware of is the really long time period of which both the monumental burial practices, but also pottery such as black and red ware or blackware continue over time. And I think there is, as Dr. Jessida had mentioned, I think that there are too few studies like that I know of, like besides I do remember Dr. Gwen Kelly also studied the pottery, but there are too few studies for us to have a much more much better understanding of the changes that happen with the pottery types in terms of specificities. But in terms of the broad range by which we are understanding them now, I think they continue for a really long period of time. And that's one of the things I think we need to think about when we're thinking of them as either as megalithic period or culture, or as the Iron Age early historic kind of context. So in a sense, I wanted to kind of think a little bit about, this is a image from Dr. Andrew Power's publication, and I think it kind of made me think in terms of like where we position the megaliths within all the other different aspects of like this particular time period. And I think it's worth thinking of it as a practice of burial that happened across kind of like a time. And in a sense, maybe that's a way in which we can understand these variations, keeping in mind the spatiality and the temporality of it. And not think of them as a culture or a period, but rather as a practice that have occurred across different periods, and think of it that way. So that's just some of the things I've been thinking of based on this. I also wanted to end by talking about and I think this is true for many of us in the different sites we work in, but the amount of like destruction that is happening to different sites, and that's one of the things that makes it harder for us to understand sites like Siruthavoor, but also makes it important to survey sites like Amur, which remain intact as of now. Thank you so much.